Is the mic on? Hello? Hello? Is the mic on? Hello? 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 It doesn't seem to work, does it? It's on. It's switched on. Yes. Welcome this afternoon. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today this afternoon to our event on taxation and, in fact, reforming taxation decision making in the European Union. I'm delighted and pleased to welcome today Pierre Moscovici, who is the Commissioner for not only taxation and customs, but also economic and financial affairs. But today you come as the Commissioner for Taxation. The Commission has recently published a communication in which it calls for a change in... This works, okay. Can you still hear me? Yeah, now it's better. Okay. The European Commission has just published a communication in which it calls for a reform of the decision-making process with the aim to eventually come to qualified majority voting and an involvement of the European Parliament in taxation matters. And so we are absolutely delighted to hear today first from the Commissioner what exactly does this proposal entail, how does he see also the politics of that proposal. And following his presentation, we will have a debate, and I'm pleased to welcome Johannes Becker, who is a professor at the University of Muenster, and Paola Profeta, who is a professor at Bocconi University, to give her their comments and remarks. But before I ask them on the floor, let me first welcome you and give you the floor. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. And I'm really pleased to be with you to discuss European taxation and in particular this Commission's communication calling for a move to qualified majority voting in tax matters. Why now? I will be frank, that's politics. It's because the mandate is ending, because the European elections are coming, and because I wanted that there would be a public debate. Why not before? Because we proved through unanimity that we could move towards fighting tax fraud and tax evasion. And I think that if we would have opened the debate before, it would have been closed already. So I think that's time for politics, that's time for democracy. And I hope that political parties, especially the pro-European, will seize the debate and try to convince citizens that it's worthwhile moving in that direction. I dream of a future European Parliament with a huge majority of MEPs calling member states to move away from the certainties and some shyness. With this communication, we are inviting member states, the European Parliament, all stakeholders, engage in such a debate on how to take more effective decisions in the very sensitive and strategic area of taxation. And very concretely, what we are doing is to propose the activation of the EU's treaty passerelle clause. This would allow the use of qualified majority voting within the competences of the treaty and in full respect of subsidiarity. As you know, passerelle clause requires unanimity to transfer matters from unanimity to QMV, but it was the only credible legal vehicle that we had in our possession. I'm convinced through now 4 years and more of experience that the way in which tax rules are adopted in the European Union needs urgent modernization. I'm well aware that this position is not shared by every member state, and if I would have had doubt, the last ECOFIN and the first discussion on my proposal would have raised them. I can see, as a matter of fact, that there is a clear majority of member states which are still attached to unanimity, even if there is a strong group, and this includes Germany and France, who would be favorable to some moves in that direction. It is possible that many of you here today share this view either, and so I would therefore like to discuss why we want to move gradually from unanimity to qualified majority voting in tax matters, and why I consider that this change must happen rather sooner than later, to say the least. I believe that maintaining the unanimity rule in tax matters would raise four major problems. First, let's be conscious that the unanimity rule was I would say, 20th century reflex, and that in the 21st century, simply it makes just no sense. As early as the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957, the founding fathers then and member states decided that taxation was an essential element of the internal market, and they decided for that particular reason to share their sovereignty over cross-border aspects of taxation, not all aspects of taxation, but some aspects of taxation. At the time, unanimity was the rule for all decisions between the six founding countries to protect national sovereignty, and this argument is of course very strong and still exists today. But if I look at 2019, that's where we are, more than 60 years later, this old-fashioned rule hasn't changed, and taxation remains one of the last bastions of unanimity, alongside with social matters and also foreign policy. To be frank, I find it totally absurd and ineffective. It is surprising, and I'm weighing my words, to observe that the unanimity rule is still the principle in tax matters, whereas QMV has become the norm in the EU, even for issues as politically sensitive as taxation, such as, for example, police cooperation or judicial cooperation in civil and criminal matters. And I really don't see why taxation should be there a taboo. Why do EU government should be able to move to QMV on the fight against terrorism in less than 20 years, but still fail to do the same on taxation? Second reason, the unanimity rule is no longer protecting national sovereignty. Rather, I would say that it prevents the emergence of genuine European sovereignty in tax matters. The debate we have opened raises a profound political question. What are the threats to our tax sovereignty in the 21st century? All we have to do is to open our eyes and to look around us. It's today biggest threat, hypothetical harmonization of rates proposed by Brussels, which is, by the way, not possible under EU law. I never proposed that. I can dream of that sometimes, but I never proposed that. Or is it the aggressive tax planning organized on a large scale by many multinationals and also by some third countries, which deprives member states of massive public revenues? I think that if you ask the question this way, and for me, the answer is clear. Today, the unanimity rule is no longer a bulwark. It is an obstacle. Only a stronger ability to decide and to act together at the union level through qualified majority voting can be protective for our member states. I'm fully aware that some member states are using the sovereignty argument to oppose the transition to QMV, and they're not only using it, they're really believing it. I'm not doubting of their sincerity. I'm afraid it might be a flawed argument and a false excuse given by some member states, not all of them, to preserve a tax framework that is on the edge of legality to attract the most affluent companies and citizens. In the long run, these models will have to change as they expose the huge external dependence of these economies, and they are damaging for the EU as a whole. So I urge member states to consider not only their own interest, but the general interest, the general European interest. Should we leave the design of our tax systems in the hands of other global powers, other countries, or global businesses, giving up on billions of tax revenues? Or do we want the emergence of a genuine European sovereignty that will guarantee a modern and fair tax framework for all? Once again, if you ask the question this way, I think the answer is pretty clear and requires a more effective decision-making rule. To be fair with member states, they have strengthened the fight against tax fraud and tax evasion, and during this mandate, we have succeeded in getting some 12 directives to combat fraud and tax optimization unanimously adopted. And some ministers who imagine that flattering an ego is enough tell me, why should we do more since you've done so much with unanimity? I think that some member states are using this progress in the current debate as evidence that unanimity is not a problem. And this certainly is not correct. These decisions were possible, and I'm conscious of that, only because of the huge political pressure on member states by medias, by a European public opinion, to respond swiftly to tax scandals that were revealed by the press. And because many of these proposals had already been negotiated and agreed by member states at the OECD, in the BEPS framework, or under the G20 guidance. And so, let's be clear, this is a moment. This might not be permanent. I don't know what will happen after this mandate in other circumstances. And what I know is that we have not succeeded in parallel to deliver some public goods through taxation. We don't have a proper energy taxation now. Our model dates from 2003, and it's not adapted to the fight against climate change. We don't have yet, hopefully, but I'm conscious also that it will be difficult, a digital taxation at the European level, even if I will try until the ECOFIN of March to reach an agreement. We don't have a financial transaction tax. We don't have CCCTB. We don't have a new regime of VAT, which would be long-lasting. We are living with a temporary regime, which is now 26 years old, which is quite long for something that is temporary. And so I know the qualities of the actions that we've led, and I'm proud of what I've done in that direction, but I also know the limits of the action, and the limits have a name. It's unanimity. And we will never be capable of delivering structural reforms on the field of taxation without QMV or with unanimity. The third reason is that the unanimity rule costs billions of euros every year to European taxpayers, to companies, to member states, mostly because precisely of tax fraud and tax evasion and the revenue gap. These are all resources that are not used to finance schools, broadband connections, climate actions throughout Europe, and this is truly shameful. On important issues which are costly for societies, many of our proposals, as I said, are blocked in the Council because unanimity can't be found. And to be more precise, today the absence of an agreement on intra-community VAT represents 147 billion not collected each year, including 50 billion due to cross-border fraud alone. Beyond the fight against revenue loss, some reforms that could help to generate savings for businesses and boost growth in the EU are still blocked. I will give you another figure. The introduction of a CCCTB, a consolidated corporate tax base, would allow the EU to add 1.2% to our growth and save more than 1 billion euros in administrative costs for our companies, which still have to deal with 28 sets of accounting rules. How long can we tolerate such a situation. I think we cannot tolerate that long, and that member states need to act now. And last but not least, and this is important for me since the beginning of this mandate, I advocated, you know that, for a more democratic governance in the Eurozone. I think that Europe won't be capable of defeating populism as long as it appears as a bureaucracy or as long as the citizen doesn't think that he has taken back control on European decisions. Democracy is a key word. And the unanimity rule, of course, by definition, is weakening democracy. I wanted to conclude with this point because I know how crucial it is for all of us. In the last few years, the European Parliament has played a crucial role in tax matters, and I want to seize this opportunity to pay tribute to its impressive work. The Parliament has been all the time an ally of the Commission in the fight to reform European taxations, and it did so as well through work in committees, plenaries, and through special committees, Tax 1, 2, 3. And I have had a very regular and fruitful exchange within the framework of special committees set up for this purpose. However, even if Parliament has fully taken up this issue, let's be conscious also that their role remains only consultative when it comes to policy response. And this is very clearly a problem of democracy and, of course, of representation. It is abnormal, maybe even anti-democratic, that decisions that affect the lives of all European citizens are taken without any control over their elected representatives. Secondly, it also raises a consistency issue with other EU policies. It is odd that the European Parliament has a say in the distribution of CO2 emissions between member states, but not in the tax incentives when it comes to renewable energy or polluting activities, because both, of course, go hand in hand. Tomorrow, if the transition to qualified majority voting is adopted, the European Parliament will be a co-legislator, and the interests of all Europeans would be better represented. And this seems crucial to me at a time when Europeans' desire for representation and thirst for democracy are so strong. Not only strong, but truly vital. And again, this is in line with history. So, to have a final word, I'm convinced that the change from unanimity to majority voting in tax matters will be a true innovation for the European Union tax policy, which could finally reach its full potential. And I can see when I look at Eurobarometers that this is now one of the major issues expected, weighted by our citizens. Today, and in the coming months, the important thing is to have the discussion and to encourage member states to take a stand and be accountable to their citizens. I'm very conscious that this won't happen during the mandate of this Parliament, this Commission, but I think it was high time to raise the debate. I hope that this debate will be present in the electoral campaign. And again, I hope that the next Parliament will stand firm with a very strong majority to tell member states, you cannot do that on your own. These are matters of common interest, and these common interests deserve a true European democracy. We are the seat of the true European democracy, and that's why we need QMV. I'm quite sure that this will help member states to reflect, because my experience as a former minister, I've been 7 years a minister in my country, and this includes 2 years as a finance minister, is that member states move and their ministers move in the Council when they feel that there is a public pressure, a public opinion expressing its will, and it's high time to do that. That's why, well, it was a strategic move. I thought it was good to wait until now, because if not, the issue would be dead already. I think it's good that it is in the debate of the elections. Well, after all, I'm not too worried that the ministers didn't love it immediately. I would say even I'm delighted for that. And to tell you, never say how councils go, but after a long round of exchanges in last ECOFIN, my final word was to tell them, well, okay, this might not be for this commission. This might not even be for the next commission. But that's the sense of history. This will happen, and you will be wrong. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner. And if I could ask my co-panelists to join me here today. Thank you so much for coming. I think you raised a lot of issues, of course, and which we can discuss. And I think we can perhaps sort of broadly group them around three main issues. I think the first big issue that you raise is there a lot of tax evasion and tax competition on the more mobile tax basis? And I think my gut feeling in this direction is, and I think some data show this, indeed we do have a problem with taxation of capital income as well as of big multinational companies relative to smaller companies. So this is sort of one sort of on the constat, on the what do we find. Now the second big issue you raise is this issue of sovereignty, which is a little bit more complicated, and I'd be delighted to hear from my co-panelists what they think about it. I mean, of course, setting a tax rate, if you come to that level through qualified majority voting, does have immediate implications for national budgets and even regional budgets. And so how do we square that circle of having a national sovereignty over a national budget while seeing some constraints coming from a European decision making? And so I'd be delighted to hear that discussion. And of course, the last and perhaps the most complicated point, especially for economists, is the issue of democracy, right? Which is a sort of what is democracy? I mean, is it currently really undemocratic that the sovereign that currently is the national parliaments decide? Or is it in fact more democratic if we have a qualified majority voting combined with a co-decision? I think what you of course said very clearly, you foresee a double vote at the end of the day, right? I mean the Council plus the European Parliament jointly, each of them voting on tax matters in the future. So I think these are sort of the three big topics, it seems to me, that we need to discuss today. And I would like to give the floor to each of you, not too long, because the Commissioner will have to leave 3:15. And I do want to give a little bit of time also for the audience to ask one or two questions. So perhaps we go in... we start on my right, Paola, and then Johannes. Not more than 5 to 7 minutes, perhaps, for your. Okay.
So first of all, thank you very much for asking me to come here to comment on this proposal on this very important issue. I prepared my comments starting from the last part, which is probably the issue of democracy, the issue of what this means for Europe and for European citizens, which is probably the dimension I'm more familiar with. So what we see, and that this was also true this was also very clear in the words of the Commissioner. We see some challenges in Europe in general because of the economic crisis, the security crisis, the increasing inequality, social vulnerability. I mean, all these things are a challenge on one side, but on the other side, a kind of opportunity to have a better intervention or action from the EU. Sometimes it's very clear from the citizens' point of view that there is some inaction, there is a lack of coordination, lack of agreement among the member states, and all these things have nurtured the emergence of populism, for example, as a rejection of the European integration projects, or even the rise of the extreme extremist parties. So this is spreading somehow around Europe as a defense of nationalist identity as opposed also to the European one. So this was somehow a kind of answer which we see spreading around European countries to some difficulties and challenges in terms of growth, stability, and democracy in our Europe. Of course, there is another possible answer, which is having a stronger Europe, somehow more coordination, and this requires some reforms, some new tools, for example, in the area of tax coordination. So I also went through the Eurobarometer survey data, and actually in autumn 2018, I found that 42% of European citizens say that they trust the European Union, 48% they do not trust, and 10% don't know. And the values are even different across countries. For example, in Greece, only 26% trust the European Union, while in 2006, the percentage was much higher. So this is because it was 57%. So there is a clear space for improvement, for a possibility to work in this direction, and the project of more integration goes exactly in this direction. Of course, the unanimity rule implies less coordination because the veto of just one member state is enough to prevent agreement. And now with 28 countries, this is much more difficult from what happened before. It was much less problematic with a smaller number of countries. And as you said, it's also used in many other areas. So changing the unanimity rule is probably a very important point, a very important starting point for having more integration and more coordination. And looking at the point of view of the, let's say, of the citizens, there is some debate. For example, when there was this debate on the case of Apple, for example, that was decided by EU antitrust regulators within the state aid procedure. So Ireland was granting illegal tax benefits to Apple. So this probably, of course, this is very strong from a citizen point of view, because the idea is that somehow these large corporations, these big tech industries or digital industries may find a way to avoid taxes while the citizen or the work, which is much less mobile, find it really more difficult. So it's for a dependent worker, it's much more difficult to move or in order to avoid taxes. So this is for sure something that at the end is bad, in the sense that it nurtures populism, anti-European sentiment. So we wonder what we can do in order to coordinate before ex ante and try to avoid this type of phenomenon, this type of situations. Of course, unanimity also means a very slow decision process, so there is also an issue of efficiency somehow behind, and also other areas. So I made the example in the sense of combating tax abuse and this base erosion and profit shifting actions, but also the fact that we needed a proper digital tax or a proper tax on environment. This would be possible with the change. There are even stronger somehow ideas, especially among academics. So there is this idea, for example, of guaranteeing even a national fiscal union with the European fiscal union beyond the national ones to intervene into the economy even when there are crises. So this is even more. This is a step further. I'm not saying, but I mean, we know that these issues are very important. So probably starting at least with this more coordination based on the majority, on the qualified majority is a first important step. So why has unanimity failed somehow? I just want to, of course, unanimity, we know, I mean, those are from basic theory of public choice, we know that it's almost impossible to reach unanimity from aggregation of heterogeneous preferences. I mean, it's a kind of failure. We have the famous impossibility theorem. So, and the EU countries are heterogeneous according to several dimensions. They are heterogeneous also on their view of the size, the role of governments, on the level of economic development, political institutions, country size, the way they are open or not, or more specialized. What is their preferred somehow tax, their favorite tax instrument? I mean, they really are different, and of course, this makes it very difficult to agree when it comes to tax issues and tax coordinations. They are different in terms of size. The small countries, for example, they rely much more on level of taxation in order to attract firms, and this is part of their budget. So to go to the issue of the implications for the national budget. So this is a serious issue, but this heterogeneity at the end is exactly what makes it difficult to apply unanimity, and so it's something that we really have to take into account. And of course, as the last part of the story, it's difficult to. I think it's difficult to change unanimity if we need unanimity to change it. So it's this is probably the most difficult part of the story in terms of changing the procedural the procedure we are discussing this afternoon. Exactly the fact that we are close to the elections may help to open the debate, because we know that this type of reforms are somehow easier in these times. It's important to have to inform citizens and individuals. So the fact that there is this perception of Europe as, let's say, a little bit more distant, it would be good to have in the debate the idea that a new rule would go in the direction of reducing rather than increasing this. So we have to explain this to citizens. Let's say there is also an issue of gradualism, probably. So how to change the rule immediately, or in some steps, depending on the type of issues that are discussed under the new rules. And possibly there is also the possibility that some countries will agree immediately, and they probably should start working in that direction, those who agree, and the others somehow will follow. Of course, a dual system is never the best thing. It's a second best, of course. It's not a first best, but somehow to start the process, we need some action to start in some direction. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's move to our second discussant, Johannes, and then we will give back the floor to you, Mr. Commissioner. Johannes, yes.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. I would like to start with the question of democracy. I don't think that the decision between unanimity and majority voting is a question of right or wrong, or democratic or undemocratic. It's a question of whether we are there yet, if the time is ripe. And it seems that the majority voting is accepted by groups, by homogeneous groups, which have a very strong group identity. And unanimity is important in groups where there are many which are fractionalized, which have many subgroups, with each of them having their own identity. Belgium comes to mind, or Switzerland, right? And the question is, how does that look like in taxation? And from my perspective, it seems that these taxation identities are very stable. So it's not that likely that, for instance, Ireland will find itself in the same coalition, so to speak, with Germany, as it is for France to be in the same group of interest as Germany. right? So there is the case for unanimity voting here because we have these tax identities, Germany being the high tax country, the production location, Ireland being the low tax country, the holding location or the headquarters location, right? I think there is a case for unanimity voting, and it will be a project for the future to develop a group identity for Europe as a whole, right? But that said, I don't think that it is right to frame this whole discussion just in terms of harmonization or the subsidiarity. That's also wrong because we have had some harmonization, the 4 freedoms, for instance, and this has paved the way for tax competition. Okay, so we have these, we have a lot of tax competition in Europe, right? And you have a whole set of instruments to engage in tax competition unilaterally, but you're very limited in fighting tax competition due to these 4 freedoms, right? So there's an inherent asymmetry. Okay, so it's very, very hard to fight on your own against tax competition by other countries. So there are these externalities. So there is a case for regulating tax competition on the European level. And this is very hard. So I agree with Pierre Moscovici here. This is very hard without having something like the majority rule. But then again, I would say I do not agree that we cannot do anything. So we have done a lot and we have achieved a lot. And I'm very happy with the progress in recent years. So as it came up, the digital services tax, I'm pretty sure that we would have a digital services tax if some large countries, for instance Germany, would have been not so ambiguous about it. So I'm not sure that we really depend on the unanimity rule. If we have a strong, decided coalition of countries that want to push through something, either by via enhanced cooperation or by pushing through by finding some consensus, I think very, very much is possible. All right, so for now, I think that the unanimity rule is too attractive. Why? Because tax competition is attractive for some countries. So before we have a chance to get rid of the unanimity rule, we must take measures to make tax competition less attractive, right? So for instance, I think if we find a large enough coalition of countries that apply a minimum tax, that makes it less attractive to shift profits to some low tax jurisdictions or tax havens within the EU, right? Then it becomes less attractive to be on the other side, so to speak, right? And so unanimity rule is important for those who find themselves in a minority and know that they will be in that minority all the time. And if your whole business model is built on something that is in danger, if we have majority voting, you won't give it up. But we can reduce the attractiveness of this without the unanimity rule. And I think a lot of that is going on in the BEPS process and in projects going on within the EU. And this can be done without the unanimity rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there has been a little bit too much agreement, I have to admit, here on the panel. So perhaps before I give back the floor to you, let me add a sort of a comment that was made by a prominent person in the country I know best, which was a sort of, and I would love to have your reaction to that one, which was basically to say, well, look, if we move to unanimity, to qualified majority voting, we will have the problem that post-Brexit, the northern European countries are in a minority and can be overruled, and then this instrument will be used so that taxation income flows into the EU budget and will be redistributed around in the European Union. So this fear was expressed in my country by a prominent economist.
And so I just would like to hear your reaction. There is clearly this fear in some quarters that once you introduce that, it will be misused. It will not just be used. And there I'm grateful that Johannes was emphasizing this point. That we have an issue in a single market where a capital market, capital goods, labor, everything is very integrated. We have an issue that by its nature, the single market makes it easy to do tax avoidance, right? But then there is the fear, well, will this not be misused for other purposes? And perhaps you can react to that point.
Maybe I want to react to one point raised by Johannes. It was about the story of the digital tax. I've been a commissioner since now almost 5 years, in a few months at the end of the mandate. And I must say, these were, for the tax commissioner, exceptional years. When I was first nominated as a commissioner, I knew that I was going to be responsible of economy and finance. I didn't know that I was going to be in charge of taxation. And I learned that just during the press conference of Jean-Claude Juncker. And and I asked him a few years ago, as we are a good friend, but Jean-Claude, why didn't you tell me? And he told me, I was afraid you would refuse. And this is quite significant, because when I was finance minister just before, I must say, with all due respect to my predecessor, Mr. Šemeta, that when my team came to see me, Minister, you need to meet the tax commissioner. And I told them, you're a finance minister, it's quite a hectic life. Do I really have to meet him? Yes, Minister, just like in the game. Why? Well, he has some issues. He wants to talk to you about VAT on horses. There is also an infringement procedure, and there is also a case in the court. Okay, let's meet Mr. Šemeta for half an hour. And during the 20 years before, let's say, that's not Mr. Šemeta especially. There was no capacity at all to decide on anything on taxation. And so it was really a portfolio which was a sacrifice. And it has changed. Why? I would say several matters, but you cannot consider that those matters are there forever. First, there is change in the international scope. FATCA, then BEPS, the G20 involvement, the OECD role. This is one thing, establishing tax good governance standards. Second, scandals. And for me, the scandal is always something which is a disaster. But for somebody who is a policymaker, it's an opportunity. And I would say that my strategy was always, there is a scandal, let's build a response. And so it took 7 months to have a directive, whilst before it took 7 years not to have one. That's very different. Third, media linked to scandal. Then the rise of a public opinion saying, we cannot stand it. And this is also linked to the crisis. And finally, I must say in the Commission, there was a strategic choice from Jean-Claude Juncker, because obviously it's not just because I would have refused. He thought it was important to have that as a priority. Because after the LuxLeaks, he said, well, this Commission must show that we're really an example on that. And I must say that the President of the Commission sometimes is suspected, he's a former Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Never, ever, I had a total white card. I never lost an arbitrage inside the Commission, including on matters that could be controversial, such as public CBCR. He was always on the side of fighting tax fraud and tax evasion. And so it is a priority in this Commission. Let's imagine that tomorrow, the international impetus loses strength, that scandals become an habit, that in the Commission it's no more a priority, that it's not anymore a big portfolio with a commissioner who has the capacity to address the issue and to talk to public opinion. Okay, in the next Commission, in the next 5 years, it can come back in the past. And this is why you cannot say, okay, you can do things through unanimity as such. I would take another of your points. It's about digital taxation. It's clear. I can be frank here, that it would have been better if there would have been a stronger and earlier agreement between France and Germany. France was really the driving engine with the Commission, and Germany was, if not reluctant, hesitant. And they just came at the last day with a last-minute proposal in December, which was an amendment, finally, of the Commission's proposal. And it would have created, I think, of course, a better climate if it would have been an agreement. But I'm quite sure that it would not have been sufficient. You would have had an agreement between 25 member states, probably. But then you come to the 3 member states which are still opposing at present time, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, and it wouldn't have been enough. I was a finance minister when we were working on the savings directive. It was before the mandate of this commission. Well, until the end, Austria and Luxembourg blocked, and there was a Franco-German agreement which was very clear. So, not to be too long, I come then to the democratic issue. What is Europe? It's 28 member states who have put a part of their sovereignty in common. And on tax matters, we are not touching their sovereignties. We're not touching on rates. It's very limited. It's some aspects of taxation, which are cross-border, some rules. We are not going to take everything from member states. We don't want it. I cannot touch on a tax rate. I'm not going to even propose that. But if we are not capable of defining a general interest and also to accept that we have common rules, then we can say that's the end of the story. And I don't know who is the prominent economist. I know that Wolfgang Schäuble is in favor of QMV. I know he's not an economist. I know that neither I am. I know that Olaf Scholz also said he was in favor of QMV. There are conservative politicians in Germany. But I can imagine that kind of reflex. But if you play a game when you think that the same are always the winners and the others are always the losers, that's not called democracy. That's called something different. And in the end, it raises a problem. And that's what populists finally are against. And so when you're in democratic rule, you accept sometimes to be in the majority, sometimes to be in the minority. But we're not talking about simple minority or majority. We are talking about qualified majority voting. And you can even define the level of qualification. I will take again the example of Digitax. I don't know how many votes in the Council represent Ireland plus Denmark plus Sweden. 7% maybe? If you take another criteria, which is population, what's the same? 7%? Something? 10%? Well, can you say that you're blocked forever? Because I'm nothing against them. Huh? I fully respect the present rule. But for the future, if we are not capable to take that kind of decisions to qualified majority voting, it's very likely that then the EU will stop moving on. And this is also good for Eurozone matters. And I can see that's another point with a high degree of preoccupation, the aggressivity of some ministers inside the EU group. And if we live that way, we are not going anywhere as far as Eurozone reform is concerned. So democracy is good at all levels. It was a short story.
Okay, great. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions, remarks, comments. Please raise your hands and do identify yourself when you ask a question. There's a gentleman there in the back. There.
Me first, I guess. Hi, Peter Ark from the Polish Economic Institute in Warsaw. I wanted to ask, because unanimity is probably, as some of the speakers said, a bit of a failed issue, that you won't get those countries to agree, some of those, as you mentioned, to agree on that issue. But maybe there are other things. For example, the VAT gap or the fight, because you mentioned that we have 150 billion euros not going to the taxpayer, to the tax offices. And this could be an issue that could, unite most of the European countries and in a way, and also increase the level of taxation in most of the countries, because Poland has a good record with that. For example, from the 2.5 GDP tax VAT gap in 2012 to 1.1 in 2018. Probably the Commission's data is going to confirm that. But it's something that most of the countries can cooperate on. Thanks.
Thank you. We have here the lady. No, there.
My name is Bernadette Segol. I'm the former General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. You have mentioned that you envisage only a few topics on which unanimity would be, or qualified majority would be the rule. But you also said in your introduction that taxation was requiring unanimity, but also social matters. And I wonder if in the list of the things you would like to see as a qualified majority voting for tax, you would include labor taxation.
Right. So then we have a gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Panos Gredis, representing European Public Organization. Let me put next to the strong word used many times of democracy today in taxation matters, the other word, hypocrisy, that means also in terms of politics. In taxation, common consolidated tax base, 26 years discussing, Commission, European Parliament, big parties, no decision. You mentioned that the taxation of savings took a lot of time. Could we say that is a kind of illusion to discuss to abolishing the unanimity for taxation? Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the front. So third row, sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm a journalist with Law 360. My name is Todd Buell, and you mentioned something very early in your remarks about how you said some countries have tax practices or do things. Your words were used on the edge of legality, and I just wonder rhetorically, is that the right way to try to convince countries to move in a direction of unanimity when you like basically pointing the finger at them and saying you're doing something that's more or less illegal? I mean, don't you expect them to just say, no, we're not, and we're going to basically walk away from the table? It just caught my ear, and I'd like to ask you about that, so thanks.
Well, perhaps we take those four already.
The first question is, and there are also remarks from Paola and Johannes, but how to convince? How to convince to move to, you said that in the end, to move to unanimity. Because we need unanimity to get to qualified majority voting. My experience is that the game changer, as far as tax fraud and tax evasion is concerned, was and is public opinion. And this is why, frankly speaking, what I'm raising here is a political debate. And I'm doing that now, precisely because there is the European election, and there will be a new European Parliament. Because if there is no public opinion, if there is no pressure from the outside in the room of the Council, then we're stuck with unanimity forever. If there is a public debate, if there are commitments taken by European political parties, if the next European Parliament has, I would say, when I look at tax matters, there is no EPP, no PS. Of course, there is some subtleness. But on all matters that I've raised, I see a majority of something like 500 to 550 MEPs who are in favor of that. You've got only the strict nationalists who are against. Right. Then I think that's a game changer, because the Parliament will be confronted or confronting member states, and it will be a very powerful ally. So to obtain unanimity, it's not only about discussing in Brussels or in the Council, it's also about public opinion. It's about politics. And of course, after that, you can use this or that example. When I look at VAT, we have proposed a reform to move to a definitive VAT regime, which could save probably 40 out of the 50 billion euros fraud on cross-border VAT. Everybody knows it. that's not enough. So it's not only about rationality. To convince, you need to use those rational examples, but you need also to introduce some political debate. What is I cannot read myself.
Well, this issue of bordering legality, whether that was the right pitch.
Yeah, I didn't try to be rhetoric for a minister here. I know that, of course, we are talking in public, but there is no secret about that. There is no tax haven inside the EU. And this is something that sometimes I'm being reproached by some NGOs telling me, okay, your blacklist of tax havens, for example, is not relevant because you don't have this or that EU country. And I can define the point, and I say that there is no EU country which is a tax haven. If you look at international standards on tax good governance, they all have automatic exchange of information, they all are BEPS compliant, and none of them has zero rates. Okay, so I'm not naming and shaming, but it might be a slight nuance. We've said, and it was in some of our CSRs for 7 countries, that some countries have legislations that are still too favorable to not fraud, but aggressive tax planning, aggressive, excessive tax optimization. Once I tried in a semantic effort to call them black holes, which was a bit provocative too. And it's true that when we discussed that in the framework of the ECOFIN, it was not the best council I ever had with those 7 ministers. But well, still, it's in our CSRs. And so I think things must be said frankly. And what I observe is that it helps them change. I will give the example of one particular country, which is Netherlands. Why? Because Netherlands are making now considerable effort to change a kind of culture, which is to try to be attractive through a very strong tax competitiveness. And so I think things are moving in the right direction. I didn't want again to name and shame. That's not the way I will try to convince, but I was trying to explain maybe why some are reluctant to unanimity, others for different matters, and I can understand that. You were talking about Poland, for example. I'm very well aware that those countries who have joined the EU in the early years of this century did that to recover national sovereignty, and that it's always difficult to ask them to share this sovereignty on delicate matters because they feel that it is renouncing to something. And my argument is that, no, you're not renouncing to your national sovereignty. You're gaining, on the contrary, some leeway on those matters and some action in the world. And again, this is limited to our tax matters. I was asked by Bernadette about labor market or labor taxes. This is something we cannot do because it's not in our competencies as EU. We don't have competencies on individual taxes or on labor taxes. But to add one point, I'm commissioner for tax, so I'm talking about QMV on tax. But this commission is favorable to QMV on other matters, which are mostly external policy and social policy. And as well, my colleague Federica Mogherini and my colleague Marianne Thyssen are very supportive of moving through qualified majority. Our view is that unanimity is a remembrance of the past, and that QMV is progressively becoming and must become the general rule of decision-making in EU. But again, we're talking about qualified majority voting. We're not talking about the 50-50 rule. And you can also raise a threshold and define, I don't know, super qualified majority. That's a point that is political too.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more questions, 2-3 more questions. So I see one question here in the front, another one in the front. And if I could get one more lady, then we are well done. So please.
Yeah, Holger Kramer. Does it work? I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, Holger Kramer. I come from Germany and I spoke on behalf of myself. Just a political topic. Many people in Germany, it's maybe very German, I don't know, but I could imagine you have the same situation in France, have the feeling that they are overtaxed. Yeah, so in Germany, the local level is grabbing our pockets, the regional level is grabbing our pockets, the federal level is grabbing our pockets, and now we start a discussion that the EU level is grabbing our pockets. And let's be realistic, if your idea is coming to life, it will be an on-top tax, not an instead of anything tax. Are you really sure that we create enthusiasm in a broader range of people and citizens? I have in mind that especially in France you had demonstrations because of some sense of diesel taxation. That's a little bit the question. What do you think about really about the acceptance of that? Yeah, and the second thing is more a legal thing. Also very German maybe. Taxation issues are topics, fundamental topics of national sovereignty. Yeah? I could imagine that if it comes to a constitutional court decision in Germany, that an idea like this will not survive this court.
Okay, there's the second here.
Michael Castagnera from the University of Brussels. From my perception of negotiation, if you want things to move against a few players, you need a bargaining chip. So shouldn't the Commission actually encourage a core to form a unified tax base with perhaps a tax on whatever comes out because you are below some floor? That would encourage the minority to join the rest?
So a group of countries going
yes,
ahead.
With a CCTB
sure.
for
which is the
10, exactly. Say 10 countries, core countries that could have a threat on whatever comes out should be taxed somewhere.
And I have a lady all the way at the back, and then we conclude the questions. Yes, and you will get a chance after.
Thank you. I'll make life a bit easier. I'm Louise Heenan. I'm the Irish Fiscal Attaché, and seeing as we've been mentioned a little bit, I thought it might be worth taking the floor. It's been a very interesting debate. I'm not going to deny that taxation is a very sensitive issue for every member state, but I thought because the Commissioner has been very elaborate in saying that this is, timed with view to the European Parliament elections, which are forthcoming. I wondered whether we should also consider building maybe on the first question we've had in this round, whether you've also engaged with national parliaments, because in the ECOFIN discussion that was quite an issue raised by some, in particular Northern European finance ministers, that their national parliaments wouldn't see it as an enhancement of democracy to move from the national to the European level. I think the role of a national parliament in setting tax policy shouldn't be underestimated. If you look at the Apple decision in Ireland, for example, more than 2/3 of the Irish Parliament, so cross-party support, supported the government's decision to appeal that, and that's an issue that's currently before the European courts. So if you could just maybe reflect also not only from the European perspective, but from the national perspective. Thank you.
First on overtaxation. This is certainly an issue. And when I was finance minister myself, I made myself famous for a remark saying that I felt that people expressed a ras-le-bol fiscal. No more taxes. And that's what we have seen in France 6 years after with the Gilets jaunes, and obviously people don't want to be overtaxed. But precisely, we're not talking about taxes on individual revenues. We're not talking about labor taxes. We are talking about something different where I think our citizens don't feel there is overtaxation. And we'll again take the example of digital taxation. The problem is not that we have overtaxation on digital, that we've got obviously undertaxation, an enormous undertaxation, because those companies don't pay their fair share of tax where they create profits and value. They pay little or even no tax. And when you said that my colleague, Margaret Vestager, decided that the fact that, Apple paid 0.05% effective rate was state aid, that was precisely what we said. And if I sum up, I would say that digital companies pay something like 9% for corporate tax, while other companies pay 23%. So we've got, on the contrary, a problem of level playing field. And if you ask the people, do you think that digital companies need to pay more? And I'm not talking about the GAFAs. I never speak about a GAFA tax, but digital companies, they will say by an enormous majority, no, they don't pay enough tax. So I don't want to overtax ordinary taxpayers, but I think that ordinary taxpayers think that they have been paying much too much, while others have been totally protected. And that's precisely what it is about. And that's precisely what our competence is about. For the Constitutional Court, I know how difficult it is. I know the role of the Bundestag. I certainly respect the role of national parliaments, because in the end, if you imagine that the member states would agree on the pastoral clause, this would need to be also agreed and endorsed by all national parliaments. And I want to be very clear. The fact that there is QMV doesn't deprive national parliaments from their role. First, to move to QMV, then when there is QMV, and of course, then you're talking about your famous economist in Germany, the national parliament will always have its say. For the Constitutional Court, I don't know, I'm not that competent on that, but I imagine, I said, I don't know who is the economist, but people like Schäuble and Scholz are precisely lawyers, and usually they're very cautious with the Constitutional Court. So I imagine that they believe that there is a way there, and again, this can be discussed. As far as reinforced cooperation are concerned, because that's the technical name for trying to build a unified base at some, if not all, I would say, in principle, I'm deeply convinced that there is a way that could be, or an avenue that could be taken. I would certainly favor that. And we tried. On FTT, we launched a reinforced cooperation. Wolfgang Schäuble and myself were the two ministers proponents of that, and then we found a group of 11 countries, then 10, because one withdrew its consent from the reinforced cooperation. But it was early 2013, and we are early 2019, and there is no FTT either. So that's not that easy. I think to build the reinforced cooperation, you need to have first, I would say, an agreement. I will say something which is absurd, but it's a kind of reasoning by absurd. Let's imagine that on the DigiTax, in the end, in March, that won't be exactly the case. You've got 25 countries saying, we agree on this model. 3 oppose. Then it would be relevant that the 25 say, okay, we are doing something together. Because it would be quick, on the basis which is already known. If it's not the case, it's not really more practical to have a reinforced cooperation than to move through unanimity at 28. Because the consensus is also, as you said, very difficult to build. So you need to have a pre-consensus to move to a reinforced cooperation, but this can exist. And finally, I fully respect those countries who oppose DigiTax, whether they are Ireland, Sweden, or Denmark. And I understand why they're doing this. And I'm also very aware of the opposition of some national parliaments to that. So we'll see what happens in the ECOFIN of March. But I'm saying that in the future, we cannot be stuck by that. If we want to have an EU who is not just living on what it is today, but that can make progress, that can also deliver on those matters which are, again, highly awaited by citizens, we need to move on. And that's why I know that the debate I launched is not a pressure on today's government. And I of course, proposed that in the last ECOFIN. I was not surprised by the reaction of ministers. I've been before moving to the COREPER. This is a debate for the future. But, well, we'll see it. I'm absolutely sure that it will take time. Of course, when we're saying that there could be a first agreement on 2019, no. 2025, maybe more realistic. But one last word, because I'm sorry I will have to lead, but you maybe could run.
1 minute.
Or maybe more than one,
yeah.
2, 3, 4. And I had something urgent to do now, which was unexpected. But one thing you must know about my proposal is that it's not a take it or leave it.
Right.
I'm not proposing to move all tax issues
No, you have
from
5 steps.
unanimity to QMV. I'm proposing a progressive approach, starting with those matters who are consensual, such as administrative cooperation, and this is, of course, highly required. Look at the recent CumEx scandal.
Sure.
Then other matters could be translated, and in the end, more structural reforms could be translated after the experience or return on experience on things which are more consensual. And that's something that I think member states could consider. I understand that a member state can say, okay, no, I'm not translating everything to a QMV, but part of it, what is already almost in the unanimity reasoning, why not? You know, one minister said about flattering ego, sent a letter to colleagues saying, I don't understand why Pierre Moscovici wants to move to QMV. He's done so much as a tax commissioner. It's fantastic, 14 directives. So I said, no, I know what we've done. I know what we've not done. I know why we succeeded. I know why we also did not succeed. And we need something more structural than just flattering, but I can also reverse the argument. If we can do that through unanimity, let's do that to QMV. That's much easier, and it's going even faster. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Well, so Johannes and Paola, perhaps you want to react to 1 or 2 final points, and then we close the session. Johannes?
Yeah, I have a couple of points. So I think staggering such a reform is a good idea. Maybe one could even start with, I have the impression that the member states' interests are not so much opposed in VAT, and much more so in direct taxation. So this is one point. Another point which hasn't been mentioned is that if we have centralized decisions on tax rules, this is only a partial harmonization, as long as tax administration and enforcement stay under national sovereignty. So we have some experience in Germany with that. So tax administration is crucial. It's a thing of the lender, and this plays a big role, actually. So there are systematic differences in the audit culture, let's say, and that is in line with the incentives coming out of the fiscal equalization system in Germany. So this has to be kept in mind, that even if you have centralized rule making, if a whole country thinks that a rule is wrong, then it's just not enforced, right? So that everybody says, yeah, we have this rule on the European level, but we know that it's not right. So go along without, right? Yeah, a couple of more points. So this, just a side remark, this overtaxation thing in Germany, the ratio of tax revenue to GDP is flat since the 1950s. Okay, so it goes a little bit up in the boom, it goes a little bit down in the bust. Otherwise, it's flat. Yeah? I think equally overstated is the argument of national sovereignty of taxation. We already have some important limits. We cannot have something like the American guilty in Germany, even if we wanted to, because we have European rules. right? So there are already limits, but these are mostly defensive. So we cannot. So the EU now forbids us to do something, and I think it is maybe it's time over a longer horizon to be a bit more. To be able to build something on the European level, and not so much just to outrule certain national initiatives. A final remark maybe. So what I think is, so we now had representatives of 4 big member states here. And I think I sometimes hear people from periphery saying that during the Euro crisis, they got the impression that Europe is ruled by Merkel, the French president, and the ECB president, right? And to shift to unanimity may reinforce these concerns that actually
the shift to QMB will reinforce.
Sorry.
Well, okay.
Yes,
Paola.
This maybe be an issue. No, I would like to comment on the needs of public debate. I think it's very interesting because in order to prove or to discuss this type of proposals, we need some public debate and we need the public opinion, because we always have country members that are against, especially because of all the reasons that we said. But I think in this case, it should be really well communicated somehow, because the impression that this is an extra tax, which is not, it may become very popular, and so this is a kind of risk in terms of how things will go. So we of course, even in my country, if citizens have the impression that they already pay too much taxes, but I would use exactly the opposite argument, so that something which was said also before, that given that you have the impression that you are paying so many taxes, and you still also have the impression that if you are a big corporation or a digital corporation, you don't. You can have some ways to avoid this. So basically, this is exactly going in the direction of convincing people, or having more popular consensus towards this type of issues. But if we confound the idea that this is over-taxation, then of course we will never move from where we are. Although this may be a wrong perception, because even in Italy the fiscal pressure is not much higher than in other countries, but there is the perception that we are paying much more taxes than what is paid in other countries. So I think also there is a way to communicate, which has to be a little bit more effective, or let's say a consensus. So I don't know whether this will enter the political campaign, given that we are close to the elections. I understand the strategy of launching this exactly because of this moment, but probably it has to be elaborated also with respect to the way we communicate, and people become aware of the entire process. Also, the idea that there should be some kind of gradual process. On one side, it may be very attractive. On the other side, we know that when there are veto players, and this is the case, gradual process is even more difficult because of the existence of veto players, and this is the typical case. So it's a very complex issue.
Well, great. Thank you so much to both of you, and to all of you for having come today to today's event. I think this topic, decision-making in taxation, will be with us for some time. As the Commissioner said, probably not even solved in the next Commission, but for sure the debate is ongoing, and it will be continuing to be there with us during the campaign, also for the European Parliament election. Thank you for coming.